What's up, everybody? I'm Joey Wilson, host of the Tracer podcast, and today I am joined by Dr. Joe Atkin. Joe is a sports medicine doctor based in Salt Lake City, and as a sports medicine doctor based in Salt Lake City, he sees a lot of people who are spending time doing endurance sports in the mountains. These are trail runners, they are bikers, mountain bikers, skiers, and we're going to spend some time today talking about injuries that happen in these sports, how to prevent them, and what to do when they do happen inevitably. So, Dr. Atkin, thanks so much for joining me for this discussion on the Tracer podcast.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Joy.
So, yeah, absolutely. So, as always, the goal of every conversation on the Tracer podcast is to help people get faster and better in their endurance sport. Specifically, we spend a lot of time talking about trail running and ultra marathons and running in general. Although a lot of what we talk about overlaps with biking and skiing and other sports. And obviously, injuries are a big part of dealing with the challenges that this sport presents to us. So, tell us before we dive into that topic. Just tell us a little bit about your educational and professional background and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Sure. So I trained initially as a family physician at a residency program with Florida State University, and then completed a sports medicine fellowship with the University of South Florida. And then came to Utah, where I've been practicing now for 11 years. Working both in Florida and in Utah, I do work with athletes at every level, including high school athletes, college athletes, professional athletes, and weekend warriors. Definitely, just statistically, there are a lot more weekend warriors in the world than there are professional athletes. And so we see every level and every type of athlete.
Excellent. So you're in Salt Lake City, your clinic's in Salt Lake City. Tell us a little bit about what the most common things that you see in trail running or in endurance sports. We don't really necessarily want to go into what happens to a basketball player
Sure.
versus a football player or a running back versus a linebacker, those kinds of things. Although I know those are things that you do handle, but in endurance sports, what are the most common things
Yeah.
that you can think of that you see?
Overuse injuries by far are more common with endurance athletes than traumatic injuries. Although every endurance athlete is going to have traumatic injuries throughout their career, overuse injuries are by far the most common.
So
With
can I
Mhm.
interrupt really quick on that? Can you just explain to our listeners, like from a bare bones level, what is the difference between a traumatic injury versus an overuse?
Sure. Overuse injuries occur secondary to the same motion occurring over and over and over again. Whereas a traumatic injury will be an event caused injury. So, like a fall or an impact.
Or like
Um,
rolling your ankle.
right.
Rolling your ankle would be a traumatic injury, whereas you put in 100 miles this week and your knee's starting to hurt is going to be more of an overuse.
That's exactly right. I know that
Got it.
a lot of the people who use Tracer are going to know about IT band syndrome. They're going to know about plantar fasciitis. Plantar fasciitis, IT band syndrome, those are overuse injuries. Whereas if you had a rolled ankle, that would be a traumatic injury.
Got it. Got it. And I bet you're right that almost everybody listening to this has either rolled their ankle on a trail or had their knee hurt at some point, or their foot. And we'll definitely get into those. So IT band high on the list, plantar, which is the bottom of the foot. What are some of the other ones you see?
Hamstring injuries are very common in runners.
Yeah.
Um, the other ones include patellar tendonitis, quadriceps strains, patellofemoral pain syndrome, patellar tracking anomalies. calf strains, shin splints. We actually use the term medial tibial stress syndrome. It's a little bit more global than shin splints, um, but every runner has had shin splints. Every endurance runner has had shin splints.
Yeah. Okay. So so basically what I hear from that is every part of your lower body typically becomes an issue. As an uphill skier, sometimes my elbows actually have overuse problems, but from pulling,
Mhm.
pushing. Well, let's focus mostly on just from the glutes down. That's usually where we're dealing with things. And so I guess the question that everybody would love to know, that I would love to know, and I'm sure most people do, is what are some of the things that can genuinely help us prevent injuries? And there's some very cliche answers out there, so I'd like to kind of dive into this in as much detail as we can, and just assume that nobody, that we're taking this from the ground up. So let's not make any assumptions about what we already understand about these things. But as somebody who treats these problems when they come in, what are some of the things that just prevent people from showing up in your office
Sure.
altogether?
Uh, Ironically, nutrition is probably one of the biggest things that is overlooked. Having proper
Mm.
nutrition and hydration helps people to avoid injuries. We see people who try to overhydrate with free water as opposed to supplementing with, electrolyte-rich fluid. Electrolyte-rich fluids are important to have. Overhydrating with free water can be problematic, but it's always important to get the right balance.
And
People
by
who,
free water just means pure water without electrolytes, right?
yeah, exactly. People who don't have a good nutritional plan are going to have overuse injuries as well. There is a lot of athletes who unfortunately don't fuel properly, and so when you're not fueling properly, you're going to have overuse injuries. And then another important part of prevention of overuse injuries is variety. People can call it cross training or whatever they want to call it. But we definitely know that the people who avoid injuries tend to be the people who do more than one sport. There's actually a really interesting kind of anecdote where a football team that won the national title, it's probably close to 15 years ago now. Ohio State University, they have something like 96 athletes on their football team, and all but three of them had more than one sport in high school. So these were people who excelled, definitely excelled in football, but all but three of them excelled in multiple sports, and they avoided injuries because they were playing multiple sports as opposed to one sport. We always recommend
That's
that soccer players don't play soccer 12 months out of the year, but they try to branch out and play other sports a few months out of the year to make sure that they're not only playing the same sport constantly.
that's fascinating. Those I'd love to dive into both of those. So let's start with the nutrition and hydration. There's a wave going through the trail running population, let's call it, of of a much higher emphasis on getting carbohydrates in your body when you're training and racing. And another part of that has been the push for more hydration and specifically more sodium in that hydration, as you mentioned. And we've actually already done some great discussions about those two things. One of them on carbs, that our listeners can go back and listen to some of our previous episodes, and on sodium and how important that is. But what we didn't talk about in those episodes that I'd love to go into with you is how that actually works. Like what happens in our bodies when let's say that we're drinking too much water and there's not enough sodium, or we don't have any fluids and or we're low on carbohydrates, how does that actually lead to oh no, I just blew out my IT band just flared up. I'm not going to finish this race. And not only that, now I've got to spend a month or two kind of figuring out how to rehab it. So how does it lead to that
Sure.
outcome?
So on the most basic cellular level, the way that our muscles actually contract is by uh, gates in the cell membranes that open and allow calcium to enter into the cell. And then calcium enters into the cell and binds a receptor that causes actin and myosin to contract against each other, and that's what causes muscles to contract. Those mechanisms are happening very, very, very rapidly. And so calcium is constantly moving inside and outside of the cell. And the sodium is actually used to send the cell signal to to the muscle to open those calcium channels. So if you don't have sodium and calcium at a high enough level, you're going to have um, the signal being telling the muscle to open the cells to contract, and there's no electrolytes to actually do the process.
Interesting. And so then how does that lead to an injury? Because to me that seems like, well, my muscle doesn't fire. So wouldn't that prevent injuries? Or like, how does it get out of whack to the point
Sure.
where something breaks? And what actually breaks?
Sure. Maybe kind of giving an analogy to like an engine in a car. If the parts of the engine aren't firing properly, there's going to be damage to the engine.
Mm.
The muscle is designed to fire when it's told to fire, and when it doesn't fire when it's told to fire, you'll eventually end up with injury. A single muscle is comprised of many, many, billions probably muscle cells. And inside all of those muscles are multiple different units, they call them. And you don't fire all of the units all at once. You fire units at different portions of the time. And so if you have some units that are supposed to be firing and they're not firing when they're supposed to, it will lead to injury.
Fascinating. So uh, sodium, in the proper concentration in our fluids is critical because, as we've pointed out, drinking too much water will lead to hyponatremia, which is a reduction of the sodium concentration in your cells and in your blood. So replacing the sodium that we're losing in our sweat is essential, basically. What is your opinion on the other electrolytes? Because I've heard conflicting things on this. I've heard some people say, it's really good to be ingesting the other electrolytes along with the sodium when you're on a very long effort, or it's hot outside and you're sweating a lot. Others I have heard say that you don't lose calcium and magnesium and potassium as much as you lose the sodium. So supplementing those can actually be counterproductive because in some of the things I've heard, that can signal to your kidneys to actually let go of some of the water and flush some of those excess electrolytes. In your opinion, where do you stand on that issue?
So it's actually kind of interesting what the concentration of the electrolyte replacement fluid Gatorade was made from. So the story on how Gatorade was actually manufactured was a physiologist at the University of Florida was asked what could be done to help the athletes on the football team not you've heard the term bonk probably where you kind of
Oh
yeah.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
what can be done to help the athletes on the football team not bonk? So the physiologist literally took swabs and swabbed all of the athletes' sweat. And then he tested the sweat to see what the concentration of water and what else was in sweat. And he found the electrolyte percentages in sweat. So he literally just made a drink that was that combination, water plus sodium plus calcium, potassium and magnesium, I think, were what was in the original formula. I would have to actually go back and look at what was in the original formula of Gatorade. But that's what the original formula of Gatorade was simply what was found in sweat. Now he gave it to all the athletes on the University of Florida football team, and they hated the taste of it. So he added sugar, which wasn't found in sweat. But the sugar actually had two benefits. The first was the athletes could tolerate it. It was palpable to them. And the other thing was the sugar actually assisted the uptake in the gut of the electrolytes. So we know that if you put salt in water, your gut uptakes some, but if you add sugar to the salt, it uptakes the salts significantly better. So the electrolyte makeup of electrolyte replacement fluid, such as Gatorade, perfectly mimics what you lose in your sweat.
Excellent. Excellent. Uh, yeah. And okay. So here's a takeaway for everybody. If we want to prevent injuries, one of the best ways to prevent an injury is to get enough water, sodium, other electrolytes, and carbohydrates as well, because those will keep everything firing the way that they're supposed to fire. And according to Dr. Atkin here, that will prevent muscle fibers from misfiring and leading to potential injuries, overuse injuries in particular. And I can imagine it probably reduces the probability of a traumatic injury as well, because if your muscles stay strong and in control, then when you roll over a rock or something, you're not extremely vulnerable to the weakness of, say, your calf muscles or your shin muscles, and you're able to kind of counteract the forces that you may have when you're running through rocky terrain or you step on something that you don't expect.
Definitely,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, is there something else you wanted to add to that?
Definitely keeping your muscles working properly is going to prevent traumatic injuries just as well as it will repetitive motion injuries.
Awesome. Okay, let's move to the second. That's great, and an unexpected answer. So that's what we like. Let's go into the cross training. A lot of people cross train quite a bit in our sport, and it seems to be maybe half and half, at least in my estimation, of people who enjoy doing other things. I personally love to ski in the wintertime, and I take running a little less seriously. And then when it's summer, obviously dive into the running. Um, so you're saying that the cross training does it complement the muscle build in a way that prevents, like, can you explain to us, like, what are the mechanisms of cross training that help people prevent injury?
Yeah. So when you kind of specialize in a sport, you're going to build certain muscles and muscle groups more so than others. And one way to definitely have an injury is if you have one muscle group overpowering the opposing muscle group. A really good way to describe it is I see a lot of throwing athletes, pitchers, javelin throwers, who really work hard on making sure that their throwing muscles are really strong.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have, we don't see it as much in professional athletes because they have learned it over, a career, a lifetime of throwing, but we really see it in younger athletes. If they're working on their throwing muscles constantly and not working on their opposing muscles, then their throwing muscles kind of overpower their opposing muscles, and their opposing muscles can't prevent the injury. Um, I I think the easiest way to actually kind of help people understand it is our core muscles. One of the most common injuries, and runners are going to have this, endurance runners are going to have this, lower back pain. If we don't keep our core strong, we're going to have lower back pain problems. Cyclists see it more so than runners. If you keep your core strong, your back will not hurt as much. Yet, if we don't keep our core strong, our lower back is going to hurt a lot. The best way to, keep our core strong is to focus on all of the muscles around the entire core. It's not like you can only work your rectus abdominis muscle and hope that that's enough to protect your lower back.
So I'm reminded of two experiences I had. One was IT band. I was running hard up a mountain, kind of getting competitive with one of my friends, and we were pushing it. And we came over the top, and we were running down the backside, and we were pushing it. We had gone really hard on the uphill, and now we were going hard on the downhill. When suddenly I felt my knee tweak, and but I was okay. I kind of kept running, and then I got home later that day and sat down for a while at my desk. And when it was time to get back up, everything had gone completely sore, painful, everything, like the injury set in. And that started me on a quest of trying to figure out what was wrong with my knee for months. And I tried rest, I tried ibuprofen, I tried ice, I tried rolling. Nothing seemed to be solving the problem, until one day I was just searching it and found a site on the internet that was a very poorly designed website, but it said, here are the top 3 things to do if your knee hurts and you've been running. And it said to do side leg lifts. So just lay on your side and do the old like 1980s aerobic move where you just lift your leg to the side. I think one of them was clamshell exercises with the band, but I just started doing the side leg lifts. And within a week, I was sure that it was working. And within 2 weeks, I was running downhill as hard as I could to see if I could get the pain to come back. And it was gone. It was completely healed. And this is after months of trying everything. Is that a typical thing? And what's your like? Why did that happen? What's
Sure.
going on in a situation like that?
Um, if I'm understanding your situation well enough, I think that probably what it was is you're a runner and you're used to running, and running is repetitive motion. I mean, do you have any idea how many steps that you normally take in a week? And it's the same motion over and over and over again.
Right, right. Yeah, hundreds of thousands of steps probably.
Yeah. And so all of your hundreds and thousands of steps, your muscle is doing the same thing. And if you're not doing anything to build the opposing muscles, you're going to you're going to you're not going to have anything to support it on the backside.
So these
Hamstrings. Oh,
yeah, yeah, go ahead.
hamstrings are an interesting muscle in a human because they are large volume, but they're not densely packed. They don't fire very much. And so during the gait cycle, the hamstring muscle only fires at the very end of the late swing phase to control the to slow the kick of the forward progression of the leg. And so
Mm.
during the running phase, it's not propelling us forward. The hamstring is stopping our leg from swinging forward so that we can then plant it to take the next step. So it's not the muscle that gives us power when we run. It controls the leg so that it's not so that it stops swinging forward. So when we don't work our hamstrings and when we're not working on keeping our hamstrings strong, it's a common muscle to injure because it's relatively weak compared to the quadriceps muscle. So we have this very powerful, strong quadriceps muscle, and if we're not working our hamstring muscles, then we then we then it's easy to injure. And that's something that a lot of endurance runners don't pay enough attention to. They're constantly running. And so they're constantly working their quadriceps. 95% of their gait, though, is their quadriceps. 5% of their gait is their hamstring. And so they need to work their hamstrings more in order to prevent injury.
Yeah, that's really amazing. Another injury that I've had is my elbows. I mentioned
Yeah.
when I'm doing a lot of backcountry skiing and I'm pushing, and what I dealt with for well over a year was this pain kind of in the outer side of my elbow, and I tried everything. I tried strengthening my triceps, which seemed like the obvious place to strengthen, but the irony was that those were getting plenty of reps, right? Like
Mhm.
that's all I was using. And once I figured out that my shoulder muscle up higher, once I started doing the opposite motion, this is kind of congruent with what you're saying, kind of the opposite loading where I had to lift instead of pull down. I started doing that, and it started, like building strength in my upper shoulder. The pain was gone once again within like a couple weeks. So I guess that's a key takeaway for people is if you are dealing with something, if it's your hamstrings, like how do you know if it's your hamstrings? If the hamstring's injured, is it the quad that is weak, or do you strengthen the muscle where the pain actually is? There's a little bit of a I'm not sure how to reconcile that.
Sure. So if you have a hamstring injury, you need to strengthen the hamstring. But the right way to strengthen the hamstring that is already injured is not to do concentric hamstring strengthening, but rather eccentric hamstring strengthening. The difference being concentric means you're shortening the muscle under load, and eccentric means you're lengthening the muscle under load. So the classic eccentric hamstring exercise is called a Nordic hamstring exercise.
Yeah.
Some people call it a Russian hamstring exercise, but essentially what the exercise entails is you're kneeling and somebody, a partner, is holding your ankles down to the floor, and you prevent your upper body from falling forward. So you're hinged at the knees and you start falling forward, but prevent the upper body from falling. What that does is it lengthens the hamstring under load, an eccentric exercise, which is the best way to rehab an injured hamstring.
Got it. And if you ever want to feel really weak, go do this
Yeah.
because it makes a fool out of most people. It makes everybody look very unathletic. I can only get like a few degrees over 90 degrees before my body kind of falls to the floor and just really exposes how weak, compared to that motion, most people are. I've seen some NFL players like Tyreek Hill, fastest receiver in the NFL, and he can just go up and down over and over on his hamstrings. It's amazing. Most of us are not even close to that. Okay, so question for you. Let's say that somebody's running along and they feel something. It's not quite an injury, but they feel a tweak. They feel something that's kind of like a little bit of a hint that something's going on. How do we interpret those feelings, and when do we need to stop dead in our tracks and do something else, and what should we do?
That is a really tough question because it very well could be a number of different things. Sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes it's not a big deal. But a lot of times that is going to be your first indication that an injury is coming on. So runners in particular, they will get IT band injuries all the time. And that's one of the injuries that I do see a lot of athletes will start feeling before it like fully hits them. As opposed to hamstrings, which are more commonly kind of an acute injury. A lot of athletes who have hamstring injuries will say to me, I was just running and I felt like a rubber band snapped.
Hmm.
That's how a lot of athletes will describe a hamstring injury. Whereas with an IT band injury, they'll tell me after the run, I really felt the outside of my knee aching. So It's significantly more, so it's significantly different depending on what the injury is. So I don't know that I'd feel comfortable making a blanket statement that says if you start feeling something, slow down, because sometimes you're not going to feel anything until the rubber band snaps.
Yeah. Okay. Good to know. I've read that slow twitch muscles are more resilient to overuse injury than fast twitch. Is that true or is that a myth?
I don't know for certain, but I do know that slow twitch muscles are used for endurance. So it would make perfect sense to me to say it that way.
That the more slow twitch muscles you have, the likelihood of injury might be decreased. So if you can train more of your muscle fibers to become slow twitch, would that be something that would lead to less injury probability?
Probably to a point, but you don't want to push it over the edge either way. So if you had 100% slow twitch muscle fibers, you're at a higher rate of injury than if you had a mix. Something we definitely know is that mixing is the is a good way to prevent injury. Having a good mix
Hmm.
of fast twitch and slow twitch is a better way to prevent injury than if it's all one or the other. That's also k- um, I think an important part of this conversation is also not just injury prevention, but also mortality prevention. We know that a mix of cardiovascular exercise and resistance training actually lengthens your life expectancy more so than if you were a dedicated cardio athlete or a dedicated resistance athlete. I think everybody probably who listens to you will understand that. Has that ever happened before on your podcast? Is the camera falling?
Yeah, if you're listening to this and not watching it, Doctor Atkin just dropped his phone, but that dropped his camera. But nope, no problem. That's par for the course.
Sorry about that. I think that probably everybody that follows you will understand that if you a bodybuilder, we all know that hardcore, strict bodybuilders have those, random. Everybody says, "Oh, he was such an athlete. He was so built and everything," and then he died of a heart attack when he was
Mm-hmm.
45. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of times we see those people who are dedicated athletes and dedicated to just one one sport who die early. But the same thing actually happens to dedicated cardio athletes as well. If a cardio athlete is dedicated to only cardio, their life expectancy is actually shorter than if they're a mix of both cardio and resistance. So it's something that we know that you're better off if you do both cardio and resistance. Cardio work actually prevents your coronary arteries, the arteries that supply the blood to your heart, from getting more stiff, and a stiff artery is deadly. But resistance training actually can make them more pliable. So resistance training will reverse the stiffness that's already started to occur in the heart. So doing a mix of both cardio and resistance training is the healthiest way. Now, we also know that spending more time in the cardio actually does make your life expectancy longer. It's not like a perfect one-to-one. It's not like for every minute you do cardio, you should do 1 minute of resistance training. We actually know that humans plateau on their mortality benefit the more cardio they do. To a point, you can't do cardio 10 hours a day and become immortal. And we actually recently have learned that men require more cardio to reach that plateau. What I mean by that is the average female athlete, if she does 150 minutes a week of cardio, she'll reach the plateau where more cardio will not give her a longer life. But men have to go all the way to 300 minutes per week before they hit that plateau. You're better off doing 100 minutes a week than zero. you're better off doing 200 minutes a week than 100, and you're better off doing 300 minutes a week than 200. But once you go beyond 300 minutes a week, the average athlete doesn't increase their life expectancy.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so really the magic for, say, an endurance runner, a trail runner, or an ultra marathoner is to figure out the recipe there, like how much of each ingredient needs to be put in this recipe. Does genetics play a role in that? Like, and in speaking maybe less to the life expectancy and more to the performance.
Sure.
But if you take one athlete who has a predisposition to slow twitch muscles, let's say, very good at endurance sports, and then take another athlete who is very good at sprinting and maybe not as good at long distances. And does the response to does the slow twitch athlete need more high intensity running and more muscular work versus the person who is more fast twitch and vice versa?
I don't know the answer, Joey. That's a good question I don't know the answer to.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll back off that question then, but that's something to kind of consider is if you're listening to this, if you have a friend who their recipe's working perfectly for them and
Yeah.
then you try it and it's not working for you,
Yeah.
yeah, you might need to shift around your balance of those ingredients based on your genetics. At least you got to try something differently, right? Because you know it's
Sure.
not working for you.
I think that would be an easy answer to say, like, the same formula is not going to work for everyone the same. That's truth. That's true.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It may not be as clear cut as who's fast twitch versus who's slow twitch, but
Sure.
there are going to be variances in that come from the genetics here. Um, so some really key takeaways here that I'm thinking of. I'm hearing a general advice from you that diversity is good, and that
Diversity,
was to
yeah, prevents injury.
diversity prevents injury, and that diversity can come in the intensity at which we run or bike or ski. We could do, there's a lot of people out there that say 80-20. 80% should be easy, 20% can be hard. Some people say it should be 90-10. Some people maybe 75-25. That's probably where some of those variances are for each individual. But there's also, as Dr. Atkin pointed out, diversity in just the modality of the sport. So if you're a runner, it might be wise to get out the bike. It might be wise to get out the skis. It might be wise to do what I'm doing, which is a rollerblading. Actually, like I bought a pair of rollerblades, and there's a paved path, and like it's the best on a day after I've done a hard running workout. I can still go out there and elevate my heart rate and get my blood flowing, and yet it just doesn't seem to hammer the same muscles. It does get other ones, like my feet muscles start to hurt and other things. So whatever it is, find your rollerblades, right? Find your diversity that you can throw in there as an arrow in the quiver to prevent these injuries. Um, okay, so once an injury has truly occurred, and we know we're hurt, what is the best protocol? And maybe let's start with something like the hamstring injury, because yeah, let's start with something that's more on the traumatic side, even if it's an overuse injury, kind of those sudden injuries where something has kind of gone wrong. What's a good protocol for somebody to follow? They're running along, they're midway through the run, and boom, their hamstring is blown, and they know it. What should they do now?
So, every injury is going to be different depending on what the injury is. But so, as an example, like you wouldn't treat an ACL injury the same way you would treat a hamstring injury. But some general principles for all injuries. are that most injuries need some rehab. So you're not going to be able to just overcome an injury without rehabbing it. Hamstring injuries are going to require a different type of injury than like an ankle sprain, for certain. Knowing how to rehab the injury sometimes needs professional help. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you should be able to rehab an injury on your own. A good physical therapist is probably the best tool that I have. Having a partnership with good physical therapists is tremendously helpful in getting my athletes back. They can not only design the rehab program for the injury, but design the rehab program for the athlete. No two athletes are the same either. So sometimes I'll have one athlete who I say, "Oh, I remember the physical therapist had this athlete doing this. You have the same injury, you do this." Then they go see the physical therapist, and the physical therapist says, "Oh, this athlete's Q angle is way too high. They can't do that." So rehabbing is extremely important. We're learning more and more about the benefits of anti-inflammatory effects, which in the initial 2 weeks, icing can be really helpful in some injuries. But after about 2 weeks, icing tends to be less beneficial. As an example, with an ankle sprain, we tend to have people ice in the first 2 weeks. But then after 2 weeks, heat is actually more beneficial. It depends on what the injury is, but anti-inflammatories can be really beneficial initially. Um, so I think that the biggest takeaway for any kind of injury is, you know, identify the injury, diagnose the injury, and rehab the injury is probably the most important thing to do.
After a injury has occurred, would you recommend, regardless of whether it's an ACL, a hamstring, or something else, IT band, would you recommend an initial phase of pure rest,
Hmm,
or will you heal faster if you immediately jump into physical therapy or other kinds of motion?
sure. Again, it's dependent on the injury. We know that with ankle sprains in particular, Um, complete rest is actually takes makes the recovery longer.
Mm,
It's actually so putting load on a sprained ankle is better for recovery than complete rest. There was
wow.
actually a really fascinating research study that proved the reason why. And what they did is they actually took collagen, which our ankle ligaments are mostly made of collagen, and they put collagen in a petri dish, and if they stressed the collagen in one direction, the collagen actually started to line up in parallel with the direction of tension. Whereas if they didn't stress the collagen lined itself up in kind of a lattice work, kind of more haphazardly. And a haphazard lattice work of collagen is more likely to re-injure. Whereas if you have all of the collagen fibers lined up together, that's going to prevent further injury. So a perfect example for the need to stress it some is ankle sprain. Whereas if you have something like uh, a, a fracture, like a, a stress fracture, definitely rest is the most important thing initially and immediate.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, the takeaway there in my mind is there's nuance. And so, depending on what has happened, one of the best things you can do is have a good PT and a good sports med doc that you can reach out to or go see to get immediate guidance on what's next for you.
Absolutely.
The other thing, and that could be you, and we should put your contact information in our podcast notes here in the description so that if people want to get a hold of you, they can. And if they need a good PT, they could reach out to you and also find out who that might be. Um, but the other takeaway that I hear you saying is that rest is usually not the best thing, at least over time. It may be in the short term, you may need to, let everything settle down. But as I've seen in my life, every injury, every overuse injury I've had, the problems don't go away by just kicking my feet up on the couch,
Yeah.
ironically, right?
Yeah. You eventually
Is that,
need to do the rehab. And the
yeah,
rehab is what makes you better. Um, but for certain injuries, for certain injuries, you just have to do a period of rest.
right. There needs to be some kind of, so maybe there's a phase one time after an injury has happened where you have to be careful not to re-aggravate it. Although, as you pointed out, there's nuance there. If sprained ankles are different than hamstring pulls, we need some kind of resource online where we can click a button and say this is what happened, and maybe that's the next tracer feature is you're out there training and something happened and it tells you what the best course of action is. um, but uh, as they say, motion is lotion, right? And that movement is the recovery, that movement. And I've seen that with everything I've had. It's always been, if I, even for months, right? My IT band is hurting for months. Eventually finding the right exercise brings me out of it. Same with my elbows. Same with the hamstring injury I had a few years ago where it kind of nagged me. And eventually I just started kind of running on it anyway. And it slowly worked its way out. So it's good advice that at some point you need to get back to the strengthening of that muscle. And if it keeps happening, what's your recommendation? Because a lot of times
Mm.
people, they solve a problem, but then like it's right back in a couple months, right? So
Yeah.
what do you recommend to somebody who's experiencing recurring injuries?
If you're experiencing a recurring injury, there's an underlying cause that you need to find the root of in order to correct that. A very, uh, I mean, unfortunately, runners frequently have runners' injuries. And a lot of time, if you're having the same injury over and over again, there's an underlying cause that can be corrected to prevent you from having that injury again. A perfect example would be piriformis syndrome. I see a lot of runners who develop piriformis syndrome, and the reason they develop piriformis syndrome is because their gait is not fine-tuned. And correcting the gait mechanics hopefully would prevent somebody from continuously getting a piriformis syndrome over and over again.
Excellent. Final question here for you, and then we can wrap this discussion up, which is, it's been an awesome conversation. And I think it's going to be highly valuable to people who are dealing with injuries or wanting to prevent them. Um, it goes back to the comments you made about inflammation. So inflammation, as I understand it, and I am definitely not an expert in this field, so please set me straight here. But inflammation, as I understand it, are the chemicals that your body releases to draw attention to an injury site, so that blood flow and other nutrients and other things will kind of flood the area and promote healing really through resources. And yet we often describe inflammation as something to be avoided or
Mhm.
something to be limited and mitigated. What am I missing there? Because I'm getting a mixed message from what I'm learning.
Sure. Most of the time, our body overdoes inflammation. So our body knows that by doing inflammation, our body will bring into the injury area stem cells. The way that our
Hmm.
body recruits stem cells into an area is uh, through inflammation. But our body always likes to overdo it. And when we overdo it, we bring in other unintended things besides just the stem cells. Fluid, too much inflammatory fluid is going to inhibit healing. The perfect example would be like a rotator cuff tendonitis. The volume of the rotator cuff actually increases in size when it is injured because the inflammatory cells migrate into the injury site and cause the injury site to literally increase in size. With an increased volume of the rotator cuff tendon, it continues to be pinched, continues to get in the way of its own healing. So mitigating the inflammation is exactly what we need to do, because a little inflammation promotes healing, but too much inflammation prevents healing.
Wow. So when we say icing reduces inflammation or taking ibuprofen reduces inflammation, some other drugs, other NSAIDs reduce inflammation, the theory there is that we are never going to completely eliminate the inflammation, but that we are going to prevent the overshooting of the inflammation. And by preventing the overshoot, we actually open up our body to work better and to deliver those nutrients and healing elements into our injuries than if we just sometimes let it go crazy.
Exactly right.
Amazing. Well, Joe, I really appreciate you taking some time to explain these things to our listeners and to explain these things to me. It's been very educational. For those of you listening, if you enjoy this conversation, please go back and listen to some of the other ones, specifically on the sodium intake, hydration, as well as the carbs, because those are relevant to what Dr. Atkin has taught us today, that those things actually prevent overuse. And staying healthy is the name of the game, right? If we can continue to build consistency in our training and year round, we're just building little, step by step, and not having these big blocks of interruptions that happen when some kind of damage has occurred, that can be hugely consequential in our progress in the sport. So go back and listen to some of those, and please consider subscribing and sharing this podcast with somebody if you found it to be beneficial. uh, Dr. Atkin, thanks so much for doing this.
Of
Really
course,
appreciate you
Joey,
being
what a
here.
pleasure. Thank you, sir.